Thank you so much for being here, and this is not my first time at this festival, but I'm always fascinated by how beautiful this city is, and I think we are all very lucky that we can discuss journalism and really celebrate journalism in such beautiful settings. And we are also lucky to have a wonderful panel here, but before I introduce them, I would like to explain a little bit about the whole idea behind this session. My name is Andras Petho. I'm the executive director and one of the co-founders of Direct36, which is an investigative reporting center in Hungary. And a few years ago, I started to notice something strange. As a journalist working in a small Central European country, I was not really used to getting international attention, but a few years ago, colleagues, journalists from big developed democracies, big countries, even countries like the United States, came to us and they asked for advice. They asked for advice on how to deal with autocratic, populist attacks against journalists. Of course, they came to me, and I'm sure they came to many other of my colleagues in Hungary because they heard about the Hungarian government's crackdown on democratic institutions, including but not limited to the free press. And but of course, Hungary is just one of many places where journalists had to face these kind of challenges and struggles. And so that's why we put together this panel, and we have Ritu Kapur from India, who is the co-founder and managing director of Quintillion Media, which runs the Quint, an independent news site in India. India is often mentioned as the world's largest democracy, but in recent years it has also received a lot of attention because of the Narendra Modi's, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's crackdown on democracy and on attacks against journalists. We have Beata Balogova from Slovakia, the editor-in-chief of the SME daily newspaper, one of the major independent dailies in the Slovak Republic. And Slovakia may not be the worst country when it comes to press freedom in Central Europe, but Beata, who also happens to speak Hungarian, which is a rarity with our beautiful but difficult language. So she is very much familiar with the problems in the whole region as well. And again, even though Slovakia still has a much more vibrant news media than, for example, Hungary, it is also the country where 5 years ago a young investigative journalist, Jan Kuciak, and his fiancée, Martina Kushnirova, were murdered, which demonstrated the danger that journalists can face even inside the European Union. And we have Natalia Viana from Brazil, who is the co-founder and executive director of Agência Pública, Brazil's first non-profit investigative journalism outlet. And I'm sure that many of you were, just like the rest of the world, were watching closely last fall the elections in Brazil. And Jair Bolsonaro, who was known for his attacks on journalists, he might be gone, but his legacy is still fresh, and the problems may not have disappeared. So let's start with a round of answers on what have been the most recent attacks and forms of pressure in your own country. Beata?
Good morning. After the murder of my colleague Jan Kuciak, we thought that politicians would understand that using hate speech and attacking journalists in a European country is very dangerous, and that they would learn a lesson. But 5 years after the murder, we can see that there is more aggressive hate against journalists than ever. Robert Fico, the prime minister who had to resign after the murder under immense public pressure, he's back, he's leading opinion polls, and he might win the September early elections. He's also the best student of Viktor Orbán, and I know that my Czech colleagues would argue that it's Andrej Babiš. I know that my Polish colleagues would argue that those are the Kaczynskis, and I know that my Turkish colleagues would say that no, Orbán actually learned from Erdogan. And it really shows that autocrats are learning very fast from each other. But Orbán has been investing heavily in the whole region, and not only investing into ethnic Hungarians in neighboring countries based on their political loyalty to his ruling party, but also exporting his handbook of media capture. And sadly, that's the media capture and dismantling democracy has become the biggest export product of Hungary by now. And not only to the Visegrad region, but also I heard it from colleagues in Philippines that, you know, the argument by George Soros is emerging. And just to give an example, that Robert Fico, who really we thought that he's done and he's being investigated in several crimes, he called my newsroom a flock of swines of George Soros. And even the fact that he is suspected of the most brutal political corruption, the abuse of the system, it suddenly has a much lower weight than it was 2 or 3 years ago. And it seems that a large part of the public doesn't view corruption as such a big problem anymore. Because in return, they are getting an impulse and they are getting the promise that you can actually stick to your basis instinct and we will serve you enemies. And that's a very dangerous precedent. And again, this is happening in a European Union country where the discourse is becoming so aggressive that for journalists to try to speak about any substantial issue is like trying to quote Dante in a noisy pub. And so that situation is very similar in the neighboring countries, and we are really facing a crisis when I go back to Orbán, that Orbán is exporting the notion that the Visegrad region needs a very special kind of democracy that is adjusted to some of our national specifics, so that we can be more forgiving towards corruption and we can press more on our national identities. And they would like to cherry pick some of the benefits and some of the privileges of democracy, but wouldn't want to live up to fulfilling, you know, the basic values of democracy, like protecting minorities and such.
Thank you, Beata. Ritu?
Hi, and thank you so much for being here. I have actually spoken at panels previously here in Perugia, and I realized when I came earlier that at that point people didn't know enough about what was happening with press freedom in India. So rather than go through a lot of what I had mentioned, I just wanted to give a perspective on, in India, there is no specific law or no specific part of the constitution that protects press per se. The constitution protects freedom of speech and freedom of expression broadly, and the press and news media would be a part of that. I think it is now time for us to push for laws that protect news media itself in India, because there's a chilling factor that is going across. It's not just about news media, but for instance, there is a stand-up comic who happens to be a Muslim who was arrested for a joke they thought he may crack, for a joke he had not cracked. Or there is if there are OTT shows now, I'm told by people who are in that creative space that now there's certain kind of scripts that, that look at religion or that could hurt any kind of sentiment, whether that's caste or religion or politics or government, all of those are being, those scripts are just, those shows are just being pushed aside. So there is now an environment, there's a chilling factor which is keeping people away from certain topics, certain aspects, which are not, so it's not just about being critical of the government, it is a Hindu majoritarian, Hindu nationalistic narrative that is now also has led to a lot of Hindu vigilantism. You might have read news accounts of Muslims being lynched for alleged cow slaughter, since the cow is a holy animal for the Hindus. So that's the environment in which news media is operating. I just wanted to set that context, that it's not just a narrow attack on press freedom itself. Because large legacy media gets a lot of its sustenance and revenue from government advertising, they have either decided to crawl in the sense of, they get, I would define them by the stories they decide not to do. So either that is happening, or big legacy media is actually committed to the Hindu nationalism, Hindu majoritarian narrative that is out there, and they actually become they are actually aggressive propaganda vehicles. It is then, I think, it is a handful of digital newsrooms now in India who are really out there, and freelance independent journalists who are really still doing some of the, and I would say even in the current environment, doing some of the finest journalism I think that the country has seen. So, in that sense, all is not lost. The problem sometimes is the fact that judiciary is not a recourse always for us. So, yesterday I was listening to the panel that was here on lawfare, and now that's pretty much the playbook that's being used. So earlier it was more slap cases and defamation cases against journalists. The Wire, who you might be aware of, has more than 12 defamation cases against them. That has now changed to accusing journalistic organizations of economic crimes. Now that works on so many levels, because if, almost every independent newsroom, digital newsroom, has had an income tax raid or attack or some sort of an investigation by the Enforcement Directorate that looks at economic. These are all agencies now which are very empowered in the country. Once you've been charged with money laundering or tax evasion or any other economic crimes, as most of us in the country have, the process then becomes a punishment, because the judiciary moves excruciatingly slowly. You will not get dates, your matter will not come up for hearing, there will be restrictions on travel that several journalists have, because they are money launderers, so to say. And because of that, and that works in two ways. One, it sort of bleeds you financially, because litigation is very expensive. So, and those are all budgets that are going away from journalism towards litigation. But more importantly, the average citizen may not know better. So your credibility is really undermined, which then undermines the credibility of your journalism.
That's sorry, this is something that's, what you are raising is something that I would really like to go back to and unpack, and it's really, fascinating, but also kind of chilling to hear, that apart from the jailings and like some of the uglier stuff, a lot of what is happening in India is happening in Hungary. When it comes to how state advertising is distorting the market, and how it's putting pressure on news media, so it was, yeah, it's really interesting to hear. But let's turn to Natalia. So what's going on now in Brazil, especially now that, you know, Bolsonaro is gone? Are you all relieved, or?
Well, thank you, Andras. Actually, well, I actually wanted to talk a little bit about Dom Phillips, because I think Dom Phillips was murdered almost a year, it's going to be a year, and he was not remembered in this festival. I think he has to be remembered. Dom Phillips was a Guardian journalist who was killed in the Amazon while he was just doing his job. He regularly reported to the Guardian and the Washington Post. He had been living in Brazil for 15 years. And he's a person we all met. I'm an investigative journalist in Brazil. And because the Amazon is the largest standing forest in the world and one of the key carbon sinking systems, and it has a vital role to play in climate change, this is the biggest story in my country. So we all knew, we all report in the Amazon as part of the job of an investigative journalist in Brazil, and we all knew Don. I would never have thought that he would be killed in my country. It was extremely shocking. He was in the Amazon, in the indigenous Javari Valley land, writing a book about how to save the forests, which makes it all the more depressing. He was together with Bruno Pereira, who was an expert in indigenous, isolated indigenous tribes, so he was with an expert. He knew the land. He had been there on a 600-mile expedition just in 2018. But what happened there is that Phillips and Pereira were ambushed and killed by a criminal gang that practices illegal commercial fishing within the indigenous reserves of the Javari Valley. And the gang also has ties to drug traffickers who operate in the border and also capitalize on other illegal activities. And this is a new thing for journalists to be killed in the Amazon. And it was the consequence, the direct consequence of two policies of Jair Bolsonaro. So I'm not going to talk about like the main ways in which autocrats such as Bolsonaro try to attack the press. I wanted to focus on the Amazon. First, Bolsonaro, he worked very hard during his 4-year term to weaken the combat of illegal activities in the Amazon. They wanted to open up the Amazon for exploration, and in that, he had the support of the Brazilian military. On the other hand, he also undermined the value of journalism and journalists in the eyes of the society. Brazilian society overwhelmingly support the preservation of the Amazon, but the trust in journalism and news has gone down, and news avoidance has gone up after 4 years of the Bolsonaro government. What happened was that the Amazon became a land filled with criminal gangs and criminals. Illegal miners, illegal loggers, land grabbers, and they were treated as entrepreneurs by the government. The government received them, the government talked to them, they received their lobbies. When they were killed, they were savagely killed. Both Jair Bolsonaro and his vice president, who is a military man, they said that Phillips knew he was in a dangerous area and he was an adventurer, which is an offense to every journalist. And doing something that isn't recommendable to do. But of course, this is not the case. The security of the people who live in the Amazon and the security of the journalists who cover the Amazon should be assured by the Brazilian state. But what happened was victim blaming, and I have to say this had some effect on the public perception of what happened, because Bolsonaro has his own networks of spreading misinformation and sticking his version of these kinds of issues. I wanted to talk about the Amazon, and I wanted to talk about Dom, because I think it's important to remember them, but I think it's also important to remember that the fight for climate change means that these areas that are very important to preserve are going to be more and more prone to this kind of fight, this kind of pillage and this kind of violence. And it's not just a Brazilian issue, it's a world issue. Environment journalism is becoming more and more dangerous, and we all should know this.
Thank you, and I'm sure that we could, go on talking about the challenges and all the attacks that are coming from some of these dark forces. But let's turn to ourselves, journalists. Journalists like talking about themselves, ourselves. So I would like to know, none of this is new in your countries, regions. How did you see the response from the journalism community? How did they handle these attacks, and what worked and what didn't work, in your view? I don't know who would like to start.
Yeah, I can start. After the murder of Jan Kuciak, we really understood that we have to start explaining to the wide public why is it crucial that if a journalist is killed. Because we were getting questions like, okay, you are really shouting now, but what's the difference if an old lady is hit by a car and you are not really panicking every time? So I was standing on squares and talking to hundred thousand people, and I violated my own rules of activism. But we understood that it's okay to become more activistic for journalists when you speak out for press freedom. And there was a certain unity in that. So I remember one of the large protests when all the editors-in-chiefs of the largest media stood there in the middle of the square and were talking about the importance to respond to such a dramatic event. Also, this continued after the murder, and even up to today, whenever there is an attack at a colleague or at an institution, a journalistic institution, we are able to coordinate and unite. So it happens that last time a reporter of the public television was brutally attacked by anonymous trolls, and so we were able to, like, just in a couple hours, get together and write a protest letter. And this was again signed by all the editors-in-chief, regardless the ownership, regardless the type of the publication. And we understood that even though we have to maintain competition, and we are competitors, but when it comes to press freedom issues, when it comes to the quality of media environment, we just have to cooperate, and we have to send out a signal to the power that we are able to get coordinated. And of course, the populist would respond that, oh, okay, George Soros called you from Brussels, or foreign forces are organizing you, but they are saying it anyway. So I think that it's very important for journalists to understand that you have to be in persistent communication with the public and explain what you are doing and stand up in defense of any member of the press, even if that journalist works for a publication you don't like, even if that journalist within the frames of fair reporting writes about issues you don't like, you don't read, you don't believe in. That's very important. And we are doing it in Slovakia, and it seems to work. Also, other point is not to give up on quality journalism, which in some countries where the power is no longer talks to journalists, like in Hungary, that, ministries completely ignore journalists, they don't get answers to their questions. So it's very hard to do multi-sourcing reporting. And what is happening that journalists replace that type of reporting with opinion writing. And so I was very aware also in my newsroom not to allow that trend and to really make sure that we don't deviate from the golden rules of journalism no matter what. And it also seemed to work, and particularly for my newsroom, the appeal to integrity worked out very well, because particularly in Daily SME, in 2014, a very toxic investor entered SME, it was indicated in one of the biggest corruption scandals. And after 7 years, that investor was not able to take over my newsroom because the journalists really felt a very strong journalistic self-esteem. They got all the support from the head of our publishing house. And so it shows that you are actually able to survive even an oligarch. And so I am now telling the story of surviving an oligarch at different forums, and I think that also can be a source of hope. Then other thing that really worked, it's not to look at online attacks and political attacks as something you are completely helpless towards. I am encouraging my colleagues to report them to the police, even though you might not trust the police, but sending out a signal that the state has to protect us. And again, just a small story, I don't want to keep time from my colleagues, but after the murder of Jan Kuciak, a couple weeks after the murder, there was the most awful online attack I experienced in my life. There was an anonymous troll who actually had the nickname the cremation for Jews and liberals. And he changed his email 120 times. For 3 months, he was posting the most awful threats that I should be burned in a crematory, that journalists should be killed, hanged, all kinds of death. And 3 years after I reported it, I already forgot about it. I gave up on any solution. The police actually tracked him. And last week, at a special criminal court, he was sentenced. And it is a son of a lung specialist, physician. So it's not, like a guy from the margins. And he got a conditional sentence, but it also means quite a lot to my colleagues. So yes, you need to turn to the police, you need to put pressure on the police so that they understand that they have to train their own members so that the police can efficiently respond to journalists reporting the crimes. And that in Slovakia seems to work because the Slovak police now is learning a lot from the Dutch colleagues who established a special officer for dealing with attacks at journalists. And there is an initiative now in Slovakia, and our police chief actually promised to go that way.
I'm very jealous, to be honest. I'm not sure if the Hungarian authorities would have a similar approach, but maybe we should try. Ritu, would you like to continue?
I think a large part of my answer would have been the same as Beata's, because it's a very similar attempt. Now, some of the things that have helped is constantly reporting on, or in whichever way possible, supporting individual journalists who are under attack. For instance, in India, journalists in Jammu and Kashmir are killed, are arrested on completely trumped-up charges, and they are not, sometimes it's difficult for them to get their journalism out because there are, India has the highest number of internet shutdowns in the world, and that's partly because of Kashmir. So to be able to provide a platform outside of, to give them a platform, because sometimes doing their journalism directly is a little tough for them. Every time there is an arrest on either criminal charges or on, for instance, a fact checker, Mohammed Zubair, he was arrested for a meme that he posted in 2018, which was just a funny joke, and he was arrested. Obviously, the reasons for putting him behind bars were others, but the apparent reason was that. So collectively, constantly writing about how unfair any such arrest is. Similarly, a journalist who was arrested on charges of terrorism, even though he was just out on his way to report on the rape and murder of a low-caste woman in a village. This constant reporting on the unfair arrests and incarcerations, I think that has helped, even though, we find that we are celebrating when the courts give them give them relief in terms of bail and not really acquittal. Similarly, we have actually come together to form an organization we call DigiPub, which is all the independent digital-only newsrooms, some of whom are very small, some of whom are just 2 or 3 member newsrooms. And I think there is now a strength in numbers, so every time there is a new regulatory policy, for instance, there was a new information technology guidelines that came out which said that any individual citizen in the country can raise a grievance against anything that may have been published, and there would be a 3-tier system, but eventually an interministerial committee could ask you to take down the content. And more recently, they've come up, because the elections are around the corner in 2024, the government has come up with a fact-checking arm of the government with the Press Information Bureau. The task of that fact-checking unit is only to keep looking out for anything that team sees as fake news about the government. And that unit will then ask publishers to take that content down. So now, when you have an organization like DigiPub, and we have over almost 120 members now, publishers with us, when we come together and we, challenge these new laws and regulations in court, there is, if nothing else, there is at least a stay on those cases. So there is a pushback, and I think on a more, on the journalism side, I think we have to constantly, in this very polarized environment with young journalists, sometimes there's a lot of emotion and anger in the newsroom. I think this constant reminder that you have to not play into your own bias, that you have to stick to neutrality, to fact, to evidence base, and not to get, because that's when you start losing the trust of the audience. So holding on to the trust of the audience in India is currently so important, because the narrative that the government has pushed is so completely sweeping now. So your journalism needs to, and you have to keep choosing your battles. What kind of journalism is going to get you embroiled in litigation and take more money away from journalism, and what kind of journalism is worth risking that litigation?
And can I ask what those young journalists say to you when you tell them that, okay, you need to turn down the temperature and be?
They agree in principle, but there is also the view that if we do not, that a lot of the propaganda is coming emotionally, the narrative is emotion, the headline is emotion. So if your journalism is sort of cold and fact-driven, it may not get the audience, which is why at the Quint we focus a lot on how to make your stories as engaging, as entertaining, as interactive, as visual as possible, so that you're not playing into your own bias, but you're making your content as accessible and as inviting to engage with.
Thank you. Natalia?
So what happened, of course, Don Phillips was well known all over the world, so there was a lot of outcry after his death, and the Brazilian community, the Brazilian journalism community really stuck together and put pressure on the government to act, even though the government did not want to act. So the crime was investigated, the criminals are now in jail. The hearings are happening. Actually, there was a hearing that was going to happen last week, and it was postponed for the beginning of May. There is still pressure for justice to be had, and there's documentaries that are going to be made, etc., etc. It has become a huge story, which is a good thing. But of course, it also had chilling effect. We ourselves in Agência Pública, which is an investigative journalism outlet led, and a majority women, have become more cautious, but we know that the Amazon needs more reporters and no less. So of course, what you have to do when something like this happens is you have to continue doing their work, you have to continue their work, and you have to continue reporting on issues that are essential for the future of humanity, such as the Amazon. Also, like Ritu, we did something in Brazil that is similar to what they did. We founded an association of independent media outlets. It's called AJOR, and it's 100 different digital media outlets, and this helps us stick together when there is threats, when there is harassment, and when something tragic happens like that. But I also wanted to stress something else. Journalists, they can only be killed after there was, after the society has been convinced that it is okay to kill them because they're enemies, because what they do is not public service, because, you know, they're lefties, whatever. And this is, in this time in history of humanity, part of, you know, disinformation techniques and disinformation waves. So I think it is crucial for us to investigate these disinformation networks and these techniques and learn tools to know who are doing them and who are pushing forward these anti-journalism narratives. And in Brazil, even though Lula has taken office, he's a democratic person, there is still a lot of misinformation about environment and about science and about climate change. And this goes against journalists, but also the academia, also scientists. And it is important that we're not only subject to these waves of misinformation, but we understand them and counter them. And this is the job of journalists as well.
Can I just add one more thing, because I forget and I feel that that's very important. I think we need, especially in regimes with autocratic tendencies, care more about the mental health of our colleagues. And this is what we really realized after the murder of Jan Kuciak, but even these days. And I think that I understand, let's say, my colleagues in Hungary, in Brazil and India, that they are so overwhelmed with the daily routine. But I think that securing, let's say, therapy sessions for colleagues and being more open to listen to their stories, not to allow them to withdraw to isolation, that was the experience during the COVID. But that adds another dimension, because we are seeing our most experienced colleagues to leave. They are giving up the jobs, those who still maintain the quality journalism and who are actually in a position to pass it on to the younger generation. And if we think about the modifications that autocratic regimes force on journalism, let's say have fewer sources, you know, have fewer investigative reporting, that's so crucial. And if we don't provide a service for those experienced journalists, I think, like, if I would wake up in 20 years and look around and maybe we will be very surprised what journalism is about.
Thank you.
Thank you for adding that. Sorry, I'm butting in. I think one more very important thing in terms of how to deal with this is to keep your newsroom financially viable, to survive, to sustain. You know, one of the things that Maria Ressa very often says, to be independent, first you have to survive. So I think that's, you know, because in India, it's just a couple of large corporate houses that own most of media. And it's very important for other pure journalist organizations to survive. So I think keeping an eye out while doing all the good work on just not getting stamped out, that's really important.
Thank you. I have just one more question to ask, and then we can open it up for the audience. So if we really look at these problems that we were talking about here the last 30, 40 minutes, is that, you know, it's the source of it is that quite simply the old balance of power between journalists, politicians, other influential people and organizations was disrupted. Of course, we all know how. And, you know, our original source of power, the old dynamics was that, you know, it was us where the public, you know, turned to for information. And now they are turning some other places as well, social media. Soon they will, you know, they will use AI or whatever. So, you know, my question is that if we want to get that power back, how do we convince the audience, the public, you know, to come back to us in this changing environment? As you can see, I left the easiest question for the end. But please answer briefly, because I really want the audience to have questions as well.
I don't think that you can resist new formats, and there is no way to fight social media, but there is a way to experiment with content which is still in harmony and response to quality journalism. Even you have to balance the short formats with longer ones, and you have to explain and try to explore new audiences, but never lose the balance. You can try more lifestyle, you can try out more lighter content, but never forgetting that the essence of journalism is still, controlling power. Because if, because of the social media, you lose that function, that you are a watchdog, that's also hits back very hard on the society.
Thank you.
I think you've got to use the social media pretty much the way the powers are using social media. I think you've got to be where the audience is. If they're on Instagram, be in the formats that that are working, that young people are consuming and interacting with. I think this, the vanity of the audience must come to me and they must discover me. I think this is not the time for that. I also think that this is not the time to put your content behind a paywall. I know I just said you have to be viable just before this, but because I think there is so much of the dominant narrative that you have to be able to reach out in whichever way. And the other thing that I think is important is if you can focus a little bit on media literacy, is try and engage with your audiences on not just saying, here's, be a fact checkers and we fact checked and we've put this out, is how you can be a fact checker, how you should always look at the other side of the story. I think this, if they can be, it's one of the things that I go out with a begging bowl, is if someone can help me do more media literacy content in formats, in animations, in shorts, formats, in documentaries, in, in graphic novels, in photo features, whichever way, that the audience becomes a little more empowered to assess content themselves.
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I totally agree. I do think that this is the time for journalism and journalists to live like their golden tower and actually be more humble. I think we, like journalists, see influencers or YouTubers as enemies, and they're not enemies at all. In the Brazilian election last year, influencers who grew up like being YouTubers, they were so important. They were so important to fight misinformation, and they are open. They're more and more open to talk to journalists and learn about our skills. We just need to go to them. We need to go to them and say, we don't know how to communicate like you do. This is what journalism is. And I think there's very little of that. And I also think that journalists have to go back and explain to the audience, especially a young audience, what journalism is about. Why is this a job? People do not know. People have no idea what we do the entire day. So we had a project, a YouTube channel for young people, and we were saying, what do you do in your day? And then we were explaining, because of course, everybody thinks anybody can just fact check anything, and anybody can. But not, we do this a lot of the time. So
we drink a lot of coffee. So yes, I was told by the organizers that we can run a few minutes longer, but I also understand that a lot of you want to go to other sessions, so let's have one or two questions maybe. I think you're...
It's working now, thank you. I'm a journalist from Romania, so I'm very close to what you exposed before regarding the freedom of the press. But my question will go to Andras, who is a neighboring country with Romania, Hungary. And I would like to share you a little bit more info about how you resist under such hard circumstances in Hungary, because we know that Mr. Orban or protectors of Mr. Orban, businessmen, bought more than 80% of media, directly or indirectly. And how did you resist in such such hard circumstances? Have you received offer from the government to renounce?
No, I mean, of course, it's more nuanced and complicated, but the short answer is that what we did and what other Hungarian outlets, independent outlets, did in the last couple of years was that we turned to the audience, and basically we made a case for ourselves, and we built a membership program, and this is how we could eliminate, like, we don't depend on advertising, because advertising is very much distorted by the government. We don't have an investor, because at some point the government will find that if you have an investor, they will find and put pressure on that investor. So we try to eliminate all those potential sources of pressure. Maybe one more, and then.
Hi, I'm Luke Johnson. I'm a Berlin-based journalist and the author of the newsletter Public Sphere. I wondered if any of you could briefly comment about how these threats more so like a permission structure that ordinary individuals or even mid-level officials feel like that they can attack journalists or threaten journalists because of the rhetoric around fake news, the populist rhetoric, or is this more of a sort of government policy to criticize certain media outlets? Like, in other words, is this coming from sort of a bottom-up thing, or is this sort of more of a top-down thing?
Thank you. Who would like to answer?
I can do it. In Hungary, it is a government-propelled mechanism, which really the Hungarian government is the biggest disseminator of misinformation, but also one of the biggest harassers of journalism. So it's cracking down on independent media. It's built into the system. But in Slovakia, those are individual politicians who understood that by attacking journalists, they can weaken their criticism when they report about their corruption scandals or their incapability to run the country. And in Slovakia, the government as such did not manage to penetrate all the institutions, but as I mentioned, that because Viktor Orbán prepared a handbook how to do it, if, let's say, Robert Fico wins the next elections, I'm pretty sure that he will take very similar steps, because it can happen, what happened in Hungary over the past decade, it can happen in Slovakia in a couple years, maybe 2 or 3 years.
Can I just comment? I just wanted to comment on something. I think there's not such a separation. I think digital populists, they use the public sphere to incentivize other people to go and pull the trigger. And this is what happened in Brazil. This is what's happening everywhere. So it's not that we keep looking at these stories as if, oh, who is the government person who is pulling the trigger? They create an environment of hatred against journalists through channels that are paid with public funding, but then the person who are actually doing the violence are not the government, but they are all part of it.
That's how it is in India as well. The cases are always filed against journalists by aggrieved individual citizens, and then the very slow judiciary takes care of it, but the process becomes a punishment. The other way that they do it is by really empowering the agencies that crack down on economic offenses, and then there are economic offenses charges. So the enforcement directorate or the income tax is very, very, very empowered now to take action. So it works in both ways, but exactly like she said, anyone can be used to take on the journalist.
Thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause to this great panel. Thank you.